the first woman chosen after Adam. She was the keeper of life in the darkness. They were the church on the day of judgment. Their story is an invitation to you. Chosen even if never named, they stepped onto the ark in a world about to drown beneath the flood. 8 souls, preserving the entire human race. You know his name, Noah, the righteous man, the ark builder. You know his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but do you know his wife's name? Have you ever wondered, why would someone who entered the ark, survived, and became the mother of all humanity, remain unnamed? Not a single line written, no description, no introduction. Welcome to Prayer Station. We know so much about the ark, its exact dimensions, it's a type of wood. How long did the rain fell? But we know nothing about the woman who endured all of it besides Noah. Who was she? What did she feel? What did she do to be chosen? Or was she simply forgotten because she was a woman? Maybe you've never stopped to think. Maybe in all the times you've heard the story of Noah's Ark, you never once asked, who was the woman on that boat? But perhaps it's her silence, her absence in Scripture that speaks louder than anything else. Because maybe, in those empty spaces, God is inviting us to hear what He's never stopped whispering. I forget no one, not even the ones no one remembers. She was not named, but she walked through the floodwaters, through the darkness, and stepped with Noah onto an entirely new world. And if that's true, then the journey to rediscover the women on that ark is not just about uncovering an old story. It's about restoring the identity of millions who seemed lost in the shadows of history and religion. A redemption plan, not only for the named, but for the forgotten. And maybe you are one of them. But sometimes, what's left out isn't an accident. It's heaven holding something back for the right moment to be revealed. Are you ready to step into the next part, where a woman with no words, no title, becomes the root of all humanity today? The first woman chosen after Adam, when the waters began to rise, when the mocking laughter outside turned into screams of terror. She didn't run. She stepped inside. In the darkness of the ark, she wasn't an extra. She was the other half of a silent covenant. No one mentioned her name. No one recorded a single word she spoke. Yet she was the first woman to step into a redemption plan since Adam and Eve. Not an angel, not a mythical queen from ancient lore, just a wife, a mother, a woman living in a wicked generation where many were swept away by darkness, yet she held on to obedience. She lived beside a man the world called crazy, watched him hammer wood day after day, quietly gathering every plank while the world mocked. She didn't leave. She didn't question. She walked with him. And when the first thunder cracked the sky, she was already inside the ark. She didn't need to speak to prove her faith. She didn't need to perform miracles to be remembered. She simply stayed with the promise and stepped in the moment God opened the door. No one knows her face. No one told of her posture, her voice, or her eyes. But among the 7 billion souls who were swallowed by the flood, she was chosen, and that was enough for heaven to begin a new chapter of humanity. But if life restarted through an unnamed woman, could it be that something immense is hidden in her silence? And maybe her true role was never just to follow, but to carry life into a brand new world. Because she didn't walk alone. There were daughters-in-law chosen out of the darkness to carry humanity's future. And that's where the story begins to erupt into prophetic pieces of color. She was the keeper of life, and the darkness outside was the screaming of a collapsing world. The cries of those who once mocked now turned into desperation, the pounding of waters against rocks, washing away cities, lands, and all of history. Inside was darkness. No windows, only wood, silence, and the damp scent of a dying world. In that darkness she sat, not panicked, not complaining, just holding fast to the most sacred thing, life. She didn't build the ark. She didn't preach. She didn't receive heavenly revelations like Noah. But she embraced the stream of life as the world outside was swept into death. She was the keeper of the flame, the one who warmed the seed of life through the longest spiritual storm humankind has ever endured. That woman had no name, no voice, no glory. But within her was the hope God chose to preserve. Without her, there would be no children. Without her, no lineage to carry on. Without her, God's promise to humanity could not continue. While the world drowned in sin, she became the sacred chamber where life was sheltered and waited to bloom again. And maybe, when God looked down at the ark, he didn't just see a righteous man, he also saw a faithful woman. One who didn't need to speak, only to follow and to hold what he had planted. But she wasn't alone. Beside her were 3 other women, daughters-in-law, younger but chosen, not by chance but by divine design. And they became the bridge that carried humanity through the flood into the 3 great people groups of today. So come with us to the next part, where your story may begin with those 3 unnamed women. The 3 daughters-in-law, archetypes of humanity's 3 lineages. 3 women, never named. Not a single introduction. All we know is that they were the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They stepped onto the ark, and no one knew where they came from. No one asked about their skin color or language. At that moment, they were simply the wives of Noah's sons. But when the ark landed, they were the first to bear children in a world restored. And from there, all humanity, every nation, every race, could trace its roots back to one of those 3 sons. Shem, forefather of the Semitic peoples, the Middle East. Ham, the forefather of the African nations. Japheth, forefather of the peoples of Europe and Asia. So if each lineage began with a man, then we can also say every ethnicity on earth began with 3 women. Some ancient texts suggest they didn't come from the same origin. They weren't the same race. They didn't speak the same tongue. They were chosen not for their sameness, but because they represented the diversity God intended to preserve. Do you see it? When the world was destroyed for its wickedness, God didn't rebuild humanity from a single bloodline. He restarted with 3 distinct women so that every nation on earth would be born from that sacred diversity. He didn't choose one skin color, he chose 3. No ethnicity was favored, no race was excluded. All humanity after the flood carries the blood of 3 silent women. And you, whether white, black, or Asian, can trace your existence back to those unnamed daughters-in-law. If that's true, then perhaps what God preserved through the great flood wasn't just life, but the integrity of diversity. And if these 3 women were entrusted to birth the new world, then their role wasn't merely mothers, but divine pillars of racial reconciliation, a task our world still hasn't fulfilled. Are you ready to go deeper? Because their role didn't end when the ark touched dry ground. It was only the beginning. In another sacred symbol, the church, hidden within the day of judgment, they were the church on the day of judgment. The door of the ark shut, rain began to fall, and for the first time in human history, the world was sealed off from a remnant few. No one could enter, no one could leave. Only 8 people, preserved in a wooden vessel amidst the fury of heaven. What do you see in that image? It wasn't just a boat, it was a body set apart, a sacred space where life was protected while death flooded everything else. And the women aboard that ark, they didn't just survive, they represented the church in the midst of judgment. The church is not a building, not a cathedral, not a crowd. The church is those willing to step in while the door is still open. Those who endure darkness, mildew, and waiting to preserve the seed the world rejected. Those women, they didn't enter to escape. They entered to preserve, to protect the children, to carry the seed of a new world, to guard what God still called sacred even when all of humanity had let it go. And if today, you're living in a world unraveling where noise drowns out truth and light seems to be losing, then maybe you too are inside an invisible ark, a set-apart place where God is preserving the faithful while the world heads toward a coming judgment. Not everyone sees that door, not everyone hears that call, but those who step in become the hidden church. And in that very separation, they become the image of the church, not of this world, yet still within it. Not hard like stone, but soft like a mother's womb, cradling life in the midst of the flood. Inside the ark, there was no pulpit, no worship band, no Bible in hand. Only silent faith hour by hour and a promise unseen that one day the sun would rise and dry land would appear. If the church is the bride of Christ, then the women in that ark, they were the first foreshadowing of a body preserved through tribulation. But once the flood passed, once the cries outside faded into silence, they stepped out. No one else survived, and now, their role was no longer to tend the fire, but to birth a new generation. The question is, what will you do when you're the only one left in a world that has just been wiped clean? We invite you to continue to the next part where these women enter the decisive moment in history to bring forth life, a world that has never existed before, the mother of all nations, yet unnamed. They stepped out of the ark. No one else remained. No neighbors, no community, no ancestors, only them and barren ground. They didn't walk into a restored old world. They stepped into a completely new one, empty, cold, untouched by human feet. All that was left was themselves, and from them humanity had to begin again. These women, mother of Shem, mother of Ham, mother of Japheth, no one knows their names, no one remembers their faces. Yet it was they who carried the entire future of humankind within their wombs. They were the first to conceive after the flood, the first to give birth on land freshly drained of water, the first to rock their babies in a world with no home, no village, no one else to help. And from the children born of them, God made the nations, the peoples, the cultures. They are the origin of us all. Europeans can trace back to Japheth, Africans can trace back to Ham, Asians can trace back to Shem. But behind each bloodline stands an unnamed mother, no monument, no statue, no chapter written for them, yet in the memory of God, they are the matriarchs of all humanity. This is not merely a linguistic omission. This is a divine mystery. When a person has no name left, what remains is essence, and their essence was to give life, to endure, to serve, so that mankind could begin again. We speak much of the patriarchs, but who dares forget the first mother who gave birth in the absolute loneliness of a world just washed clean? They are a symbol of women uncelebrated on earth but remembered in heaven through the lives they quietly preserved. And perhaps that very anonymity is where God chooses to emphasize one final truth. To be the mother of all nations, you don't need a great title. You only need to be willing to carry life even when no one sees, no one remembers, no one calls your name. But God does not forget. Maybe you've lived like that too, unnoticed, unhonored. No one remembers your name in the moments you carried the most precious things: faith, hope, and life. But if heaven didn't forget the unnamed women after the flood, then he hasn't forgotten you either. Because true identity is not in records, medals, or applause, but in the eyes of the one who saw you silent, yet unshaken. And he is inviting you to step into the final part of the story where anonymity is exchanged for eternal identity. Their story is an invitation to you. They had no crowns, no thrones. No one recorded their names in history. But they were remembered by God not for power, but for obedience. Not for loud voices, but for sacred silence. Not for strength, but for unwavering faithfulness. If those unnamed women were chosen, if they, without status or influence, and were allowed to step into the ark of salvation in the darkest of days, then that means you can be chosen too. Yes, you. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to hold an important role in the eyes of the world. You don't need to stand out, be famous, or be exceptional. You only need one thing. Are you willing to step into the spiritual ark before the door closes? Today's world is no different from Noah's time. Faith is mocked. Prophecy is dismissed. Holiness is pushed aside. People are busy building, playing, spending, until the rain begins. And just like then, the door of the ark will close. Today, the ark is no longer made of wood. It doesn't sit in the middle of a dry field. It is the spiritual church, the set-apart body, the refuge for those who believe in what has not yet been seen. If you feel lost in this chaotic world, if you've ever thought you weren't worthy to be chosen, if you felt too insignificant to be part of God's plan, then their story, the story of the unnamed women, is a gentle but firm reminder. God is calling you, not to run away, but to preserve what is sacred within you, to carry life through the judgment, to become a spiritual womb warming a generation that desperately needs life. Because in every generation, God is always looking for those who have no name on earth, but already have a name written in heaven, not because they are perfect, but because they dare to believe, even in silence. Dare to keep the flame, even in darkness. Dare to walk, even when no one else joins the road. And perhaps you are the next woman heaven is watching in silence. The one carrying the lifeline for this age, even if no one calls your name. But God is still writing your story, with the very tears, faith, and endurance you're holding in your heart. If the women on the ark gave birth to the world we now know, then women like you may be giving birth to the end-time church. Are you ready to step into that door before it closes once more? Because this time, it won't open again, and the church will no longer be a distant image on an ancient boat, but you, the one hidden for the final hour, chosen, even if never named. Some people pass through history like a whisper, leaving no footprints. No one records their names. There are no days of remembrance, and yet they are the ones who carried the future within, silently, quietly, unseen, but essential. No one wrote about them, no one honored them, no one remembered them, but heaven is different. Heaven doesn't need a resume, doesn't require fame. Don't wait for a chapter in someone's book to begin your story. It only looks for one thing: a willing heart, willing to obey when the whole world chooses rebellion, willing to walk into the dark when the world's lights seem brighter, willing to hold on to what is sacred, even when no one else around cares anymore. The women on Noah's Ark didn't need their names written in the Bible, because their names were already engraved into the very lifeblood of humanity. And so is yours. Even if you've never been celebrated, even if no one has heard your silent prayers, even if your tears have fallen with no one there to wipe them, even if you felt too small, too unseen, too unimportant, remember this: God is still writing your story, not with ink, but with every act of obedience, every unseen moment of forgiveness, every quiet gesture of love, every time you stood firm, even when your heart was trembling, because in His kingdom, no one is forgotten. The one the world overlooks is often the one heaven is watching over. If you are living quietly in a world that never remembers your name, then perhaps God is calling you by a sacred name only He knows. And He is still waiting for your answer, not with loud words, but with a soft, willing heart. If this video touched something in your spirit, leave a comment, even just a simple "I'm still here," because sometimes that's all it takes. For angels to know you're listening, and for God to know you're ready. Share this video with a woman who feels forgotten, with a mother, a sister, a daughter, silently guarding life within her soul. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because we will continue this journey to uncover those forgotten on earth, but honored in heaven. Because in the eyes of the Creator, your name has already been written, long before your first cry ever left your lips. No one can erase what He has inscribed, and no one can call you nameless when heaven has known you before the foundation of time. Amen.